He dumped her because of her looks. Those were the words that slipped like a verdict in a room already full of whispers. People remembered the moment not for the sentence itself, but for the silence that followed. The clink of a glass, the soft rustle of a dress, the sudden awful visibility of one woman who had lived most of her life invisible. Before that evening, Angélica had become an expert in being almost invisible. She rose at dawn on the Montero farm, moving through the house with the certainty of someone who knew every creak of floorboard and the weight of every pan. The kitchen smell, coffee thick and black, cassava bread still warm from the iron plate, was part of her. So was the dust that gathered in the corners of the servants' room and the bruise on her hip from a careless shove months before. Her stepmother's voice cut like a thin wire across the courtyard. Her older half-siblings treated her like a family obligation best kept out of public view. They called her dutiful. They called her plain. They called her by small, efficient names that never landed as her own. Angélica never fought back with anger. There was a gentleness about the way she held plates, about how she poured tea into a chipped cup and set it on the windowsill for the men who stopped by the house. That gentleness was not weakness. It was the shape her resolve had taken. She had learned to be useful, and from usefulness to dream quietly of not being needed only for work, but for something like care. Across the city, Arthur Marin lived in glass and marble in a world where hands were measured by what they could grasp. He had been born into the predictable geometry of wealth. A private school education, a father with a firm handshake and an imperious laugh, a life where doors opened and contracts bent. Arthur's life had been sharp-edged, polished, efficient. His marriage to Bianca had been the final gilded proof of belonging. She was the kind of woman whose presence was a statement, couture and confidence, hair always a breath ahead of the room. With her at his side, Arthur felt untouchable. When the first cracks appeared, they came in numbers and paper. A deal collapsed. A lawsuit spiraled. He watched his name fall in small, permanent type on screens he had once dominated. Investors who had once queued at his office door turned away. The bank withdrew the last protective offers. Pride does not fall all at once. It peels, one permission after another. Bianca, for whom the city's light was addiction rather than philosophy, left the night the headlines changed. She left with a box of shoes and a note that only read, "I can't be poor in private." Arthur's fall was fast by the standards of the house that had never expected to be empty. There were meetings that ran late and ended without agreements. There were phone calls with voices that had once had time for him and now summoned the distant courtesy of people making small charity decisions. His father's health, long a hidden discomfort, grew worse with the stress. The friends whose presence once expanded rooms contracted as quietly as shadows. One more hand reached for Arthur in the dark. Augusto Montero, respected, old money in a different register than Arthur's family, a man who understood land and seasons and the quieter arithmetic of loyalty, agreed to help. But Augusto's help was not a gift to Arthur's pride. It was a deliberate, measured exchange. The Montero farm had its own needs. The house had an invisible daughter whose future was a sour compromise between greed and mercy. Augusto, who had watched the family dynamics with the bluntness of a man who had been betrayed by his own kin before, proposed this: capital in exchange for a marriage. Arthur listened to the proposal as if it were a curiosity presented in a book he'd never opened. To Augusto it was simple. Remove Angélica from a house where she was mistreated. Give her a chance at life without fear. To Arthur it was a lifeline with a fine print he could not yet see. It was not an ideal proposition. It was not framed as one. Arthur made his distaste into a manageable thing. He would rescue nothing more than his company's survival. Augusto's terms were firm but humane, and Angélica asked for her consent like an afterthought that she accepted with the grave politeness of a woman used to being taken seriously only when she needed a favor. Her acceptance was quiet. She had known, in the way of people who measure escapes against consequences, that the offer would change the course of more than one life. She also knew that staying meant accepting another round of indignities that might harden into something worse. She saw in Augusto's eyes a man who had the weight of many corrections on him. She saw, too, the look of a father who could afford to make a different kind of decision. She said yes because she wanted to stop being afraid at night. The ceremony the first time they stood together in the city was small and tasteful, and to anyone watching closely, brittle. There was no grand bridal party, no rapture of family applause. There were two men in dark suits, the registrar, and a handful of formal witnesses. Bianca did not attend. Arthur's father was present only in spirit and polite notes exchanged between lawyers. Augusto watched with a slow, private relief as the registrar pronounced them husband and wife. They left the registry building into a winter sky and a city that still had the habit of pretending nothing had happened. Angélica carried a single small bouquet of field flowers, a leftover of the farm's stubbornness in a square of glass. In the car, Arthur's fingers brushed hers while fastening his seatbelt and felt unfamiliar, as if he were touching silk that belonged to someone else. He said nothing about it, which became the pattern of their early days. A lot of things unsaid, and those silences stacked like bricks between them. In the apartment that would soon become his company's provisional headquarters, Angélica set about the little domestic rituals she knew. She made coffee in a pot with a ring of old stains she thought would make the place less severe. She moved cloths over a cold table and arranged herbs in jars beside the window. She listened to the soft hum of the elevator and tried to make the rooms feel like they could bear the weight of ordinary life. Arthur watched her with a cold eyes that did not notice the small domestic miracles she performed until they relieved some pressure in his day. His anger at himself shifted shape. It needed someone to contain it, and sometimes that someone was the nearest person who had the least power to resist. He grew terse. There were phrases that slid past him without punctuation and frost in his gestures when he needed a decision to be made. "This is temporary," he said once, as if words could be scaffolding. "Don't expect anything else." Angélica accepted the boundaries with the slow dignity of women who have practiced restraint. She asked no proofs of devotion. She listened when Arthur said the words and translated them into her new tasks. Paying contracts, keeping the house, making sure the documents were in order for the men who came and went. She filed papers with neat, careful hands. Sometimes late in the night, she sat by the balcony and watched the city lights and let the phantom noise of farm life lull her into sleep. The first time Arthur truly marked her difference publicly, it was not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a dismissal so small that it felt like a wedge. He had been invited to a luncheon for minor investors, men who still measured worth by old currencies and loud reputations. He asked Angélica to attend because in the calculations that had made their marriage a means to a corporate end, he thought appearances would help. A wife could be a symbol of stability. He told her to wear something that would be appropriate. Angélica chose a dress she had worn once in a small village church, modest, with a hand-stitched neckline and sleeves that carried the faint scent of lavender from the farm. She smoothed it and stepped out into the light, feeling like an offering. The room was a long glass rectangle. Conversations formed like smoke. Polite, strategic, thin. Angélica moved uncertainly at their table, her hands folded against the linen. Arthur introduced her in a voice that sounded both formal and rehearsed. "This is my wife Angélica. She recently came to the city from the countryside." It was a sentence that carried an instruction. The eyes in the room flicked to her. There were polite smiles. Then one of the investors, a man who had built a fortune on confident insults, asked, not unkindly but with the cruel curiosity of someone who had never needed to imagine consequences, "Does she speak much?" Angélica answered in the way she always did, simply, without making a show of herself. She spoke about the farm, about canned tomatoes, about the way seasons taught patience. The man's eyebrows went up, and somewhere between the words and the curve of his mouth there was a difference in the room. Arthur felt it as a small burning thing under his skin. He had always been measured by light. He had always occupied a place where a woman was supposed to be an accessory, not a contradiction. At the end of the luncheon, as people rose and rearranged themselves for the next meeting, one acquaintance said, no louder than a rustle, like a gossip dropped casually, "I hope he doesn't plan to make this permanent. A thing like that. It's not suitable." The phrase was meant to be private, but it landed. Arthur's face closed. He looked at Angélica with that tightness of a man who thinks his life story is being rearranged without his permission. She felt him looking at her, and in that look read the faintest possibility of shame. The next morning, he told her without preamble that she should understand the limits of her visibility. "For now you stay where you're useful," he said, hands on the small table as if they were holding a map. "We cannot appear like something uncalibrated. The world is fragile." Those words lodged. Uncalibrated. They were not an insult of appearance, they were a statement that she did not fit the machinery of his world. But to Angélica, they translated plainly. She was seen as an awkward piece in a place that required polished parts. She understood, and she tried to keep her dignity. She shrank into smaller ways of being in the apartment. She stopped wearing the dress she loved and began to wear good, quiet clothes that would not start conversations. She placed the chipped cup in a place that would not attract attention. She learned the way to knock only once and to stay out of rooms where important phone calls happened. Bianca, watching the city's gossip and the slow resurrection of Arthur's public appearances, saw an opportunity. She began to weave herself back into places where Arthur had once had the easiest access. She was precise, cruel in a patient way. Where love had been used as currency, she used timing and smiles. Where Arthur had once had a name that opened doors, Bianca had the kind of presence that convinced others they had not lost anything. One evening, at a private party in a hotel with gilded ceilings, Bianca arrived in a way that made light parts of the room refocus. She was with other people who validated her existence with recognition, and she moved like a current that rearranged what floated on the surface. She found Arthur as if she had been magnetized to him across the room. They exchanged a few sentences, a private history told in quick, well-practiced glances, and then she did what she had come to do. She found Angélica, and, with a smile that had no warmth, said something that landed like a bell. "You know, Arthur used to be visible," she said in a tone that suggested this was once better. She looked at Angélica as if studying an unfamiliar species. "It must be difficult for you," she added, not a question but a statement, as if pity were a weapon. Angélica felt the room shift. She had been trained to absorb slights, to not give them oxygen. But in that minute, something small in her, a tenderness she had built like a private room, cracked. She stood quietly, excused herself, and walked out into the cool night to breathe. Arthur followed. They stood on the marble steps by the fountain while the party's music fell away behind them. The city air felt sharp and indifferent. Arthur's voice when he spoke had a small, brittle quality. "You should not take things personally," he said. "People say things." "You mean the way people say things about me?" Angélica asked, not complaining but searching for logic. She had never asked him for much. She had asked only for the home he'd signed and the safety of his protection. Now he gave her boundaries and names. "We cannot be seen together like this," Arthur said, and the sentence was like a rule he had drawn to limit the embarrassment he felt. "My life is fragile. My position depends on how I am perceived." It was, in its way, a confession of fear. But Angélica heard what everyone in town had already said. She was a hazard to his image. She realized she had been traded again, not in the formal ledger of contracts, but in the casual currency of reputation. Her consent had become a footnote in a man's desperate attempt to rebuild himself. She left. She returned to the farm at first because the decision was immediate. The place she knew how to be herself without the eyes that tried to reshape her. Words rarely leave men as quickly as they leave women. Arthur watched her leave with that empty, slipping feeling of someone who had thought he had protected everything except his own cowardice. He told himself he would fix it later. He told himself she would understand. Angélica did not stay away out of spite. She returned because it was what the farm offered her, labor that made sense, and a father who, in the quiet way of his brand of love, asked if she had eaten. Augusto received her with the kindness of a man who had been counting losses and found this redemption. He closed the door against the gossip and the biting city wind and made her a soup, as if nourishment could be the first stitch in mending a fence. Word of the scene at the fountain spread with the efficiency of gossip. Bianca, sensing weakness, dug her heels in. She pursued public spaces as if to prove a point. She attended dinners with Arthur's old friends and left a trail of small, deliberate gestures that said, without cruel words, "He can do better." She maneuvered in that slow, effective way of people who have always been told yes. Arthur found himself at a crossroads he had not expected. Pride, which had long been a compass needle for him, began to behave unpredictably under the strain of public ruin. He had married as an exchange. He had promised himself he would honor the letter, though not the spirit. And yet, watching Angélica's posture as she stepped into the private darkness of the farm, something in him loosened. Perhaps it was the memory of how Bianca had left, an act that had the ruthless certainty of someone removing a fragile chandelier when the ceiling trembled. Perhaps it was the weary look on his father's face when the newspapers arrived each morning, like small, routine punishments. Perhaps in low hours he admitted to himself that the house felt colder after he had told Angélica to be useful and nothing more. He began to make small, almost involuntary gestures. He would find an email from Angélica with a list of suppliers that made his accountant's life easier. He would read a note about a repair she had arranged and feel a flicker of gratitude. When he opened a drawer by mistake and found a folded handkerchief she had left there because she liked it in his breast pocket, his fingers, the same hands that had once negotiated contracts, hesitated as if on the threshold of learning gentleness. But change is never tidy. It arrives as a tangle of progress and recoil. Arthur's world demanded appearances, and sometimes he complied. There were dinners where he kept Angélica at his side and offered the shortest polite descriptions of her. There were meetings where he concealed her like an awkward prop. And there were nights where he told himself that this arrangement was a small sacrifice for a far larger survival. Then came the scandal that would wedge itself into that fragile architecture of pride and fear. Bianca returned in a way that was not theatrical but precise. She arrived with the intention of picking at a scab and exposing what she believed was truth, that Arthur had never loved the quiet woman he had taken for reasons of convenience. She moved among the circles and began to whisper about efficiency and selection, about the ways men rebuild without embarrassing attachments. One afternoon, with the city under an indifferent rain, a message arrived from a lawyer Bianca employed. A formal threat about a claim she said had been improperly terminated, a claim meant to unsettle Arthur. He took the call in the office, pacing under the weight of men who watched him as if he were a case study. The next hour was a string of restrained hand gestures, restless fingers, choices made from the calculus of survival. He left the office on an errand that felt like a decision, and, as he stepped into the palms of the city, his phone buzzed again. Bianca's strategy worked on the edges, but the center of the trouble would soon be different. On the drive back from an investor meeting where he had promised results he could not yet conjure, Arthur's head throbbed with a fatigue he had ignored. The rain had come harder, and his hands, always the measure of his will, gripped the steering wheel with a tightness born of habit and anxiety. He moved too fast through a narrow bridge where trucks had already left water on the asphalt like a sheen of oil. A sharp spasm of pain gripped him. His vision tunneled. The car swerved, tires skidding against the wet. The world rearranged into a single violent moment where sound flattened and machines screamed. The car twisted, metal groaned like something wounded, and then silence took over with that absolute, impossible patience. When the town constable finally reached him, the city seemed an ocean away. The hospital lights smelled of antiseptic and quiet. Arthur's hands, the same hands that had once been used to sign contracts and push away the world, lay on the sheets, smeared with the pale blue of a hospital gown. He blinked as if learning to see again. Paperwork arrived, then a string of faces he recognized as necessary responsibilities. He muttered about numbers, about deadlines, about recovery. The doctors spoke in measured phrases and prescribed rest where Arthur's instinct screamed for productivity. News travels differently in small places. Augusto heard that Arthur had been in a crash and that he would be in the hospital for a week. He watched the city's lights from the farm and then made a decision that felt like a closing of a circle. Angélica, who had returned to the farm to breathe and repair the small ruptures of her dignity, heard the news in the kitchen where she was rolling dough. She felt something like a tug at the center of her chest. Not pity, not obligation, but a quiet, human inclination to not see someone who had been part of her life break alone. She went to the city. The hospital corridor smelled of lemon disinfectant and the tired perfume of nurses. She signed forms with hands that trembled only slightly. When she entered Arthur's room, she saw him there, a quiet, half-assembled thing, and something inside her softened into a kind of merciful attention she had reserved for chores and children. The first night, she sat by his bed and made tea in a paper cup because the hospital's machines made real cups a luxury. She smoothed the sheet over his knees with the careful, patient hands that had always known how to make things stay in place. Arthur woke in fragments and, in those parts, saw her. Their eyes met and the space between them for a moment resembled the one they had occupied at the registry. A place of obligation turned intimate by need. He tried to speak about the company, about investors, about the thin, dangerous business of salvage. Angélica listened and then, without grand speeches, began to do the simple, transformative things she knew, fanning his fevered face, fetching fresh water, asking the nurse when the next dose of medication would be. She found his hands, the ones that had been so accustomed to pushing and dismissing, and wrapped them in warmth. In the small hours when the hospital settled into the softest part of night, Arthur watched Angélica and felt a confusion that was not immediately pleasant. There was no melodrama in her care, no attempt to erase what had been said. Instead, there was the steadfast rhythm of someone tending the small inflammation of another person's life. He felt himself measured, not by the city's light, but by the slow devotion of a woman who did not boast. Angélica's presence in the hospital was quiet and consistent. Nurses took note of the way she remembered doctors' names, the way her hands packed the small bag of things he might need. She did not demand anything from him. She asked only if his temperature had returned to normal and whether he wanted more tea. The gestures were infinitely more significant because of their everydayness. They filled a hole left by everything Arthur thought was essential. People who watch a life from the outside sometimes mistake change for a sudden conversion. In truth, the first nights at the hospital were a slow, almost mischievous education. Arthur caught himself watching her sleeping with a peculiar astonishment, noticing the texture of her hair like a map he had never bothered to read. He found small things about her that gradually startled him. The way she spoke to night nurses in the same tone she used when calling a mare at the farm, the precision of her hands when she wound a bandage, the delicate humor she used to coax a pain to the surface so a doctor could treat it. But old habits die like winter's last hard frost. slowly, and sometimes with relapses. When he was well enough for visitors, the first person to appear was Bianca, crisp as always, her arrival a whisper of perfume and accomplished intent. She walked into the small hospital room with the confidence of someone who believed wounds were matters of image. She stopped, looked at Arthur, and then, as if reading a line of a play she had memorized, turned to Angélica. "It looks like you've been very useful," Bianca said, and there was a shade in her smile that hurt more than a knife. The sentence intended to be a compliment was instead the most subtle dismissal, a way of saying which side of a life a woman should occupy. Angélica's face steeled in a way that made Arthur watch and feel the old, inexplicable guilt. The room felt smaller. Arthur's decision, selfish, cowardly, born from a place of fear, had become a public farce that bore consequences he had not accounted for. He had traded a woman's dignity for a reprieve that was only temporary. In the quick, corrosive light of that moment, realization began to work on him like water on stone. The first part of his change would not be a confession. It would be a theft of his arrogance, one small, unperformed act at a time. The second would be a public rupture, a moment where his hands, those recorders of power, would fold differently. But that public moment still lay ahead. For now, the hospital held them in a neutral pause, an in-between that felt dangerous because it held possibility. As Arthur rested, his old life creaked in the background. Calls came from men who were polite and distant. Bianca's presence grew more insistent with each day. He remained a patient in the system he had once used to an advantage. Augusto's balance of kindness and calculation resolved into small, firm directives. The farm watched, and the town that had always gossiped about who belonged where, about which faces deserved applause, shifted. Angélica felt the pressure of being watched, of being seen, for the first time in a life measured by chores. On a wet afternoon when the storm outside ached at the window panes, Arthur awoke with a clarity that was new and painful. He watched Angélica stand by the window, a towel in her hands, looking out at the drizzle that blurred the city into watercolors. He borrowed her hands, the hands that had always arranged plates and sewed hems and now smoothed his pillows, and felt a truth press against his chest like breath. He had once believed that appearances could be repaired by better clothes, by better parties, by better company. He was learning something else, that the work of being human is not performed on a stage, but at a bed where someone tends you while you are at your least valuable. He thought of the word invisible, which had been thrown at Angélica as an insult and now felt like the wrong diagnosis for a person whose value had been quietly assembling itself in the small acts of care he had, shamefully, dismissed. Arthur rose from the hospital bed with a decision forming under his ribs. He would not make it simply with speech. He felt the need to do something that had weight beyond words. But at the edge of this impulse was the memory of the fountain under a different sky. The moment he had chosen reputation over presence, and by doing so, had pushed away someone who had only ever offered steadiness. He could feel the echoes of that choice, how it had set the current that now threatened to sweep him away. Outside the hospital, the city continued to revolve around people who had never learned to be gentle. Inside, in a room with the measured light of machines, two lives balanced, one of them beginning to tilt, Angélica made him tea. He watched her hands, older, more significant now, and felt the first true shame of a man who had mismeasured a life. He did not yet know how he would make amends, or whether the people who had watched him would accept that his repentance could be more than a gesture. He knew only that his pride had given way, in the tenderest way, to the need to be seen not as a thing to be celebrated, but as a man who had failed, and who now had to learn how to stand in a different posture entirely. When the alarm slipped into the night and the hospital dimmed, Arthur's fingers found the quilt at the edge of the bed. He picked up the small handkerchief Angélica had left there earlier, a plain piece of cotton with a faint line of embroidery. And he saw, reflected in the hospital light, the outline of his own folly. He had much to undo. The hardest part would not be the public acts, but the private ones, quiet, repeated, ordinary. For now the story paused on the threshold of change. The next moment, the next decision, would have to bear the weight of what had been lost. When the hospital lights dimmed and the machines settled into a steady, patient rhythm, Arthur did not leave the room right away. He sat at the edge of the bed and folded the embroidered handkerchief Angélica had left into a careful rectangle, feeling the raised thread under his thumb as if it were a map of a life he had never known how to read. Outside, rain sheened the city into pools of reflected neon. Inside, the ordinary task of learning to ask for help had become a kind of liturgy. He made a list that night, the sort of list a man raised on balance sheets and deadlines might trust. First, he would protect her name. Second, he would repair the wrongs he had chosen by omission. Third, he would make long public amends rather than quick private excuses. The items were simple and concrete. He underlined the first: defend Angélica's reputation. Under that, he wrote with a clumsy hand, do not let Bianca lie in public and go unchallenged. The next day, he issued a short statement to the few journalists who still cared. He did not dress it in the familiar armor of PR. There were no promises about a company rebound, no insistent salesmanship. There was only a sentence he had rehearsed on the hospital pillow. I was wrong about a person I should have protected. Angélica does not deserve what she has endured. The release surprised those who received it. Some called it a desperate bid for sympathy, but others heard for the first time an admission that weighed as truth rather than spin. Arthur expected waves, calls, questions, the old men in leather chairs who measured character by a handshake and a ledger. Instead, something shifted. The admission made him vulnerable in a new way, less commanding perhaps, but human. A few small investors withdrew politely. Some hoped the publicity would fade. Bianca fumed at the edges, her pride pricked, but she also watched, recalculating the balance of influence and spectacle. He kept the statement short, because he had learned the hard lesson that words without action are emptier than the loudest boast. He began to act. He called Augusto and, with a voice steadier than he felt, proposed legal steps to ensure Angélica's security. A trust for her, clear protections of her name against slander, an agreement that would make her the public beneficiary of any support the Montero family had arranged. Augusto listened, and after a long beat, agreed. The old magnate's relief was not theatrical. It came as a quiet, weary certainty that some measure had finally been put into place for his daughter's safety. Angélica heard about the trust in a patchwork of conversations. She did not relish being the center of schemes. The arrangement had been the reason for their marriage in the first place. The idea of a legal document conferring a kind of ownership to her freedom felt awkward. Still, when Arthur's voice reached her in the cottage where her father boiled beans over an iron plate, she recognized the care behind the measure. He had not made grand, showy promises. He had written a guarantee in ink and sealed it with lawyers. That, in his world, was close to sacrament. He also made smaller, human choices. He refused to allow Bianca to be the face of the story. When she called, coaxing and measured, to demand a meeting to talk things over, Arthur let the phone ring out. When she tried to use the law firm to file complaints that masqueraded as principled concerns, he countered by allowing the press to see her pattern. The woman who had walked away when money left, but reappeared when some veneer of recovery showed. He confronted that pattern quietly, publicly, and without need for melodrama. He refused to be shamed into silence to avoid further gossip. There was a cost, and he understood it. The men who once smiled at his table looked sour and mutinous. Arthur found his name subject to small ridicule in the way the world now speaks of men who miscalculated. He accepted the loss. He had traded that old authority for something he had lacked: moral witness. The first time he went back to the farm, it was without an audience. He drove across the roadways, through the countryside whose smells he had long neglected: wet earth, the faint rot of compost, the sweet underripe of cassava leaves. He carried with him a folded dress Angélica had left in his apartment months ago, an ordinary navy dress that smelled faintly of lavender in her hands. He did not know whether she would speak to him. He did not know whether there would be forgiveness. He only knew he needed to be there where she had gone to breathe. Angélica had returned to routine, like a bird returning to a favored branch. She rose with the hens, moved with the choreography of tasks that had kept her alive in body and in spirit. Her father watched her with a man's rough tenderness, proud that his child could hold her head. The stepmother and the older half-siblings watched her with the old, brittle contempt that takes shape less in noise than in carved-out silences. They had a way of looking at her as if she were a resource to be managed. It stung. It remained unjust. It had never been softened by kindness. When Arthur arrived, the dogs lifted their heads and then returned to their sleep. The gate creaked the same as it always had. Augusto greeted him at the threshold with the kind of look that sizes up whether a man is serious. He ushered Arthur in without fanfare, and the two men stood for a moment in the kitchen, where the sunlight fell in a clean rectangle across a wooden table. There were the chipped cups Angélica used, the iron pan that had seen 10 harvests, the smell of soup simmering. These were the trivialities that had become a cathedral of ordinary life for him. Angélica appeared with a towel in her hands, as she always did after work. Her expression hardened for a beat on seeing Arthur, then softened into the composed politeness she owed the world. She did not run to him. She did not drop to her knees. She had learned, slowly, that dignity does not need theatrical acts to exist. Arthur let the bag with the navy dress sit on the chair like a quiet offering. He moved closer, and for the first time in months his voice shook in a way that had nothing to do with injury. "I came to ask for your forgiveness," he said. The phrase was clumsy and raw. It carried the weight of a man who had finally understood that some debts are not measured in money or rescue, but in the deprivation of trust. Angélica looked at him. The farm's air filled with a long, small silence. "Words are not enough," she replied, not bitter but firm, "and I will not be a consolation prize." It was what he feared but also needed to hear, the insistence that her person was not a balm for his wounded pride. He understood then that apology had to be paired with proof he would not be a source of further wound. He stayed in the little guest room that night, not because he expected immediate reconciliation, but because he needed to demonstrate constancy. He rose to chop wood for the stove and fetched water at dawn. He learned to start a coal fire without impatience. These tasks were humiliating in the best sense. They were ordinary labors that humbled a man who had learned to command others to perform them. By the second morning, some of the neighborhood watched with secret curiosity. Arthur's hands, which had once closed contracts and signed away sentences in boardrooms, were now reddened by cold and callous, working a plow with the same care Angélica used. The motif of his hands returned again and again. Hands that once measured how people served a roster of ambitions were relearning the measure of another's life. The local gossip took its own course. Some admired, others snickered. The stepmother's face stiffened when she saw him in the kitchen pulling beans from pods. The half-siblings scoffed in the way that younger people do to cover their unease. But there was also a new look in the town's eye. A man who had come to be seen not as a threat to the household, but as someone willing to submit to it, and therefore be made honest by it. Bianca did not cede gracefully. She moved through the city with the same composed intent that had once made Arthur feel untouchable. She arranged friendly dinners, made small public appearances where she wore the sort of silk that made cameras notice. She spoke to the press with a practiced blandness. "We need to give Arthur time to heal," she said, implying that Angélica was a passing chapter. Her comments were lances dressed as roses, but attempts at coercion can backfire when one party refuses to be manipulated. Arthur refused to be paraded as an ornament to her narrative. When Bianca attended a charity event that drew the occasional philanthropic crowd, Arthur attended as well. The evening was one of gold frames and soft light. Bianca moved across the room like a wave of proper society. She approached Arthur with a practiced smile, expecting compliance. Instead, he stepped away from the crowd and, in a tone clear enough for some to hear, said to her, "I will not be used to prop up your sense of self." It was not melodramatic. It was simply honest, and it landed with a hush. Guests shifted on their chairs. For the first time, the room considered Arthur not as someone seeking forgiveness, but as someone who had found a different center. The statement cost him invitations and the easy access some had expected, but it also stripped the stage of Bianca's leverage. The worst blow came when Bianca escalated. She published a story in a glossy magazine, a piece that painted her as the wounded party, left and vilified, and implied Angélica as someone who had climbed into a life that wasn't hers by leveraging pity. The piece was subtle, a portrait of betrayal with insinuations softened into stylish prose. Angélica read the printed words at the kitchen table while her father watched quietly. Her face did not crumple. She folded the magazine and placed it under the table as if it were a gossip that had been properly handled. Arthur read the piece that night in a dim apartment he had not yet made his home. He felt hot and small, the old centro of bruised ego rising like bile. This was the moment, he told himself, where words had to be backed by public deeds, so unambiguous that the world could not misinterpret his intention. He arranged quietly, with the few men who had not yet turned on him, a modest but decisive move. He would hold a small public meeting at the town hall, not to gain votes or favor, but to take responsibility in front of the people he had hurt, and to defend Angélica's name. The meeting became a crucible. Neighbors filled the wooden benches, some came out of curiosity, others with more pointed motives. Bianca arrived, looking composed and wounded, as she had scripted herself to be. Arthur climbed to the platform and, without the usual guardrails of polished rhetoric, spoke the truth. He admitted his failures. He named the way he had allowed appearances to govern decency. He refused to allow the woman beside him, Angélica, to be reduced to gossip. Then, to the astonishment of those gathered, he did something he had never done in public. He took off his own ring and placed it on the table. "I gave her shelter as part of a bargain," he said, eyes on Angélica, where she sat with her hands folded in her lap. "I treated her like an expense and not a person. I am here to undo that with facts, not with excuses. I will ensure she has legal protection, a home that is hers, and compensation for the indignities she has suffered. If anyone tries to defame her for my mistakes, I will be the first to stand against it." The words were not thunder. They sounded more like a man finally learning to anchor speech to action. The room hummed. A few people clapped awkwardly. Others sat with mouths open, processing the strange spectacle of a rich man making restitution where once he might have made a speech of self-defense. But the decisive moment came not in print or in a small town hall, but in the long, open yard of the Montero farmhouse a week later. News of the meeting had traveled like the slow, steady wind that carries seed. The family had called a gathering that felt part family council, part community tribunal. The stepmother insisted on a statement from Angélica in front of neighbors. The siblings stood to the side, their faces taut and expectant. Augusto sat with the weight of a man who has held counsel for decades, and Arthur arrived with a purpose that made his gait different. Not the swagger of command, but the uncertain step of a man who had been unmade and was trying to put himself back together in honest labor. People spilled into the yard. Neighbors, workers from the fields, one or two of Arthur's now estranged acquaintances who had come to watch. There was a hush, like a held breath. Arthur stood before them with the trembling composure of a man who had learned a new grammar for apology. He had come prepared not only with words, but with an action that would be difficult and humbling. He walked to Angélica. The air tasted of dust and cooked beans and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. He did not reach for her hand at first. He looked at the people who had watched her disappear into service for years, and then at those who had tolerated small cruelties under the shelter of family habit. He spoke plainly. "I asked for your forgiveness in a hospital bed. I have come here today to ask for it again, in front of everyone I wronged." Then he did what the headline people would later remember, and the townsfolk would talk about in ways that were both simple and true. He lowered himself to his knees. It was not a theatrical flourish. He sank to the earth as if gravity had finally made sense to him. He held out the embroidered handkerchief, the one she had used to tuck tears into folds, and he said, without flourish, "I was blind. I see you now. I ask for your forgiveness, Angélica. I will fight for you. I will stand against anyone who tries to make you small." The act split the yard like a bright knife. Some stood speechless. The half-siblings' mouths opened into the slow realization that they had miscalculated. Some neighbors murmured words of astonished approval. The stepmother shuffled, offended to the marrow. Augusto's face folded into a look at once private and public, relief, the kind a man feels when he has watched two worlds finally face truth. Angélica listened. He had humbled himself in the only way that mattered. He had surrendered the part of himself that desired to remain unaccountable. But she was not bound to immediate mercy. She let the pause stretch, letting the dignity of her silence hold its due weight. Forgiveness, when it is given, must be freely given. "Arthur," she said finally, voice steady, "I will not be the sum of what you decide to make of me now. If you want to stand for me, stand by me, and do not pretend the past did not happen. Make it right. Not for the cameras, but for us." He nodded. Tears pricked his eyes, an old man's pride cracked by something like prayer. He promised then, publicly, that he would do more than kneel. He announced that he would help secure the farm with legal protection, set up medical care and school funds for the younger children, and establish a program that would provide fair wages for those who worked the land. He would not erase pain, but he would, by deed after deed, try to correct the ledger. Bianca watched, and in that moment, there was no dramatic collapse of villainy. She left later that week, her departure quiet and bitter. There would be no public unmasking in the grotesque sense. Rather, her retreat came naturally from the diminishing control she sought to wield. She continued to move through a world that had not belonged to her as fully now. Those who valued her company for its sheen found less sheen to trade. That did not make her a caricature. It made her a person whose tactics no longer produced the results she had counted on. The stepmother and siblings faced consequences of a different sort. The community's view of their cruelty was no longer a private, open secret, but a matter of record. They were called to account, not in ruinous spectacle, but in community pressure that demanded change. Some resisted. Others were forced to face their own quiet resentments. Augusto insisted on family mediation, a process that made adults sit in the same room and speak aloud what habit had allowed them to do in whispers. The result was imperfect and human. Grudges and apologies, small and sometimes reluctant acts of reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, Angélica returned to the city, but not as a rescued object. She came with agency. She signed the papers that would secure her future, choosing, quietly and firmly, what provisions she wanted and what charity she would refuse. She refused to be paraded as a tragic consumable and insisted on modest, practical gestures. A small apartment where she could keep the things that reminded her of home. A legal instrument to ensure the stepmother could not barge in to undo what had been arranged, and a fund for training the farm's young women in trades. Arthur, in turn, learned to keep his promises by the slow labor of habit. He returned to a city that no longer measured him only by profit margin. He attended meetings where his voice was hoarse from telling the truth. He rewired his company culture to value the people who worked unseen, the janitors, the clerks, the small staff who kept offices alive. He instituted a policy of fair wages and a foundation in the Montero name that supported agricultural workers. He sat in family mediation sessions where he apologized not as a performance, but as a daily practice. Angélica and Arthur's private life in the months that followed was not a fairy tale of constant bliss, but the quieter pleasure of a home that learned to breathe. They argued about small things, how to arrange the bookshelf, whether a pot of stew needed more salt, but their disagreements were threaded with mutual respect. Her hands taught his hands how to fold linens in a certain way. His hands learned hesitantly how to roll dough under her watchful gaze. The chipped cup that had once been a symbol of her humility became a symbol of their shared life. They used it at night for tea and put it on the windowsill where the sun found it. The embroidered handkerchief rested in the pocket of his coat like a talisman. One evening, months later, they sat at a table warmed by the light a child would one day know. It had been a tough year. Business setbacks, the slow bureaucracy of legal protection, but there was also laughter. The house held the smell of bread and the soft clatter of plates. Augusto visited often, carrying news of the farm and the stubborn pleasure of a man who had seen a plan come to fruition. He would stand at the threshold and say, in his blunt way, "Look how the place smells like home." And everyone laughed. They had a child 2 years after the fateful rain, small, calloused hands over a newborn's feet. The baby arrived like a punctuation mark that made sense of the sentence that had been long and messy and honest. The people who had once called Angélica invisible now learned a new language of seeing, not the shallow gaze of fashion and spectacle, but the slower acclaim of witnessing daily acts of care. The town adjusted. Some of the old barbs dissolved into something like respect. Others lingered as the odd residue of small bitter memories. The epilogue of their life was not a sweeping victory sung by trumpets. It was quieter. A kitchen where laughter sometimes rose above the stoves. A doorway in which they paused to hold hands before answering the day's work. A table where the chipped cup rested and the handkerchief lay folded. The motif of the doorway remained, thresholds crossed not by bargains but by chosen steps. The motif of his hands, once instruments of transaction, had become tools of tenderness. The motif of invisibility had been reversed. Angélica, seen on her own terms, moved through life without being made small again. The final scene is a small one. Arthur sits with a child on his knee, a book open in his lap. The lines around his eyes have softened into something like peace. Angélica stands at the sink, rinsing a cup, the light catching the dark of her hair. She turns and smiles at him in a way that carries both memory and present ease. He meets her gaze, and there is no need for grand words. He reaches across the table with hands that have learned to measure what matters and squeezes her fingers. Gentle, sure. He had been a man who once thought appearances could hold the hull of a life intact. He had been blind to the true weight of a human being. He knelt in a yard full of people and humbled himself in a way that did not erase the past, but pledged to make the future safer. He had not been perfect. No true redemption ever arrives in a single clean sweep, but he had learned to live the work of repair. If you have ever been judged by how you looked or felt overlooked until someone finally saw you, there is room in that story for a quiet hope. If this story moves you, subscribe for more tales that remind us the hardest things to learn are often the most human. Years later, a neighbor would tell the story of the day Arthur knelt, as if recounting something modest and extraordinary at once. The man who had once traded a woman's dignity for a lifeline had learned, with time and stubborn duty, that no life should be used as a ledger entry. The child at the table would grow up knowing the sound of a house where the kitchen smelled of bread, and the adults were careful with words. Their family, imperfect and repaired, chose to keep paying attention to the small acts that make love plausible. The last image is simple: a doorway, open to the sun, an embroidered handkerchief folded in a drawer, a chipped cup on the sill catching the light. Arthur and Angélica stand in that doorway, hands clasped, seeing each other without the need for spectacle. He looks down at his hands, the hands that once closed deals and shut doors. She reaches up, lays her warm palm over them, and for the first time in the story, his hands know how to hold gently, and they stay there.